1206 CE, the winds over the Mongolian steppe carried the smoke of surrendered camps, not from open battle, but from decisions made behind closed tents. Beyond the banners and the oaths of submission, another reality unfolded, one that never appeared in official chronicles. In the aftermath of conquest, women stood at the center of an unspoken system of control, where survival depended not on resistance, but on compliance within a newly imposed order. Fear did not announce itself loudly. It settled quietly into routines, into expectations, into lives that were no longer their own. This moment, in the early 13th century, marked the consolidation of a power unlike any the world had seen. As tribes fell and cities submitted, the imbalance was absolute. The defeated were not simply absorbed, they were reorganized. And for women connected to the fallen, wives of leaders, spouses of soldiers, members of ruling households, the surrender did not mean safety. It meant reassignment within a structure designed to reward loyalty and erase former identities. If histories like this matter to you, if examining how power operates beyond the battlefield feels necessary, then dark inquest history exists to document what official records chose not to emphasize.
Within the first year of his elevation as Genghis Khan, ruler of all Mongols, the empire expanded rapidly. Victory was followed by administrative precision. Submission was encouraged, but it came with conditions. The topic that still unsettles historians is clear and unavoidable. How Genghis Khan treated enemy wives after surrender will shock you, not because of spectacle, but because of how methodical and normalized the system became. The Mongol Empire emerged from a harsh environment where survival depended on hierarchy, loyalty, and strict codes of obedience.
Marriage, kinship, and household structures were political tools long before the first city fell. When conquest began, these tools were expanded, not abandoned. The empire did not rely solely on destruction. It relied on absorption, and women were central to that process. In the political culture of the steppe, women were not invisible. They managed camps, negotiated alliances, and held authority within family structures. But conquest altered the meaning of that authority. Once an enemy surrendered, their social framework collapsed. Status did not transfer. It was reassigned. For the wives of defeated leaders, surrender marked a sudden shift from protected positions to controlled ones. They were no longer representatives of their own lineage. They became assets within the victor's system. This transition was rarely documented directly. Instead, it appears indirectly, through records of redistributed households, reassigned dependents, and new alliances sealed without consent. The belief system underpinning this practice was pragmatic, not chaotic. Genghis Khan emphasized order above all else. Disorder invited rebellion. Rebellion invited annihilation. Control had to be thorough, and it had to be lasting. Allowing defeated elites to retain independent family structures was considered a risk. Those structures were therefore dismantled. Women connected to surrendered households were separated from their previous identities. Their names faded from records. Their value was redefined according to utility within the empire. Some were placed into new households, others were absorbed into administrative networks. A smaller number were used to reinforce alliances among Mongol commanders. None of these transitions were framed as punishment. They were framed as necessity. The psychological impact of this system cannot be overstated. These women lived with constant awareness that their survival depended on submission to a foreign authority. Their previous lives were treated as irrelevant. Memory itself became dangerous. To speak of the past was to risk being seen as disloyal. As the empire expanded into Central Asia, Persia, and beyond, the pattern repeated. Surrender brought mercy, but mercy was conditional. Cities that complied were spared mass destruction. Their populations were reorganized instead. Men were conscripted or relocated.
Women were reassigned under strict supervision. The appearance of order replaced the chaos of battle, but the cost was hidden within private spaces. What makes this system particularly unsettling is how little resistance it recorded. Not because resistance did not exist, but because the conditions made it nearly impossible to sustain. Surveillance was informal but constant. Households were monitored through obligation. Silence became a survival skill. These practices were not anomalies.
They were consistent with the empire's approach to governance. Genghis Khan believed loyalty could be engineered. By breaking previous bonds and creating new dependencies, the empire reduced the likelihood of coordinated defiance. Women, especially those connected to former power structures, were seen as potential transmitters of loyalty or disloyalty. Control over them was therefore strategic. Historical sources often describe these arrangements using neutral language. Terms like distribution, allocation, or integration appear in place of human experience.
The emotional reality, fear, uncertainty, loss, exists only between the lines. Official records focused on stability achieved, not on the means used to achieve it. For the women themselves, the loss was total. Legal identity, cultural continuity, personal autonomy, all were replaced by enforced roles. Some adapted, some disappeared from record entirely. Their endurance was mistaken for acceptance. As decades passed, this system became normalized within the empire. New generations inherited its outcomes without questioning its origins. The wives of conquered enemies were remembered, if at all, as components of imperial success, rather than as individuals subjected to profound upheaval. Midway through this history, it becomes clear that the true mechanism of control was not overt cruelty, but erasure. By removing context, by redefining relationships, the empire ensured that what happened behind closed doors would not challenge the public narrative of order and efficiency. If continuing to uncover how empires maintain power beyond the battlefield feels like a shared responsibility, then staying with dark inquest history is part of that effort, examining what stability demanded and who paid for it. The deeper the empire expanded, the more refined the system became. There was no single decree outlining these practices. There did not need to be. Custom replaced command. What began as wartime necessity hardened into administrative routine, and routines, once established, are rarely questioned. The most telling absence in this history is testimony. The women subjected to these transitions left no written accounts, not because they lacked stories, but because the system offered no space to preserve them. What survived instead were patterns, repeated across regions, across decades, across cultures absorbed into the Mongol world. This absence shaped how later historians understood the empire. Focus remained on conquests, trade routes, and legal reforms. The cost paid by those absorbed into its machinery was treated as incidental. Silence was interpreted as peace. But silence is not peace. It is evidence of risk. The treatment of enemy wives after surrender was not an uncontrolled byproduct of war. It was a deliberate component of empire building. It removed potential centers of resistance. It reinforced loyalty through dependency. And it ensured that defeat extended beyond the battlefield into the most private corners of life. This is only the beginning of that story. As the Mongol Empire moved westward and southward, the system hardened. What had begun as an improvised response to conquest became a predictable outcome of surrender.
By the 2020s, communities understood that survival required more than opening gates or offering tribute. It required the acceptance of an imposed social order that reached into households and redefined personal bonds. For women tied to defeated factions, the moment of surrender was often followed by a period of waiting. Not imprisonment in the formal sense, but enforced uncertainty. Decisions about their futures were made elsewhere, by officials whose concern was stability rather than individual fate. Time itself became a tool of control. The absence of information created compliance. Within the Mongol administrative logic, these women were categorized not by personal history, but by their usefulness to the empire. Former status offered no protection. In some cases, it increased scrutiny. Wives of enemy commanders were viewed as symbols of prior authority. Leaving those symbols intact risked inspiring nostalgia, or worse, loyalty to a defeated order. The solution was separation, quiet, procedural, and irreversible. This separation did not require spectacle, it required consistency. Households were reorganized under supervision. Movement was restricted through obligation rather than chains. The empire relied on the fact that most resistance would endanger not just the individual, but everyone connected to them. Responsibility was weaponized. The emotional toll of this system was cumulative. Women lived with the constant awareness that they were being watched, evaluated, and reassigned according to criteria they did not control.
Privacy dissolved. Even grief had to be managed carefully. Public expressions of loss for the past could be interpreted as refusal to accept the present. What makes this period particularly difficult to reconstruct is the language of the sources. Chroniclers writing under Mongol rule adopted the vocabulary of administration. They described outcomes, not processes. Transfers, placements, alliances. Rarely do they acknowledge the human disruption involved. The machinery is visible, the people inside it are not. Yet patterns emerge. In region after region, the same outcomes emerge.
Women absorbed into new households with no reference to consent. Former identities erased in favor of assigned roles. Children raised within structures designed to eliminate memory of prior allegiances. The goal was not humiliation, it was permanence. The Mongol leadership understood that conquest without integration bred rebellion. Integration without control bred instability. Women were central to resolving this tension. By reshaping family structures, the empire reshaped loyalty itself. Bonds of blood were replaced with bonds of obligation. The past was not argued against. It was made inaccessible. There is a tendency in later retellings to portray these outcomes as inevitable features of medieval warfare. This framing misses the precision involved. Many empires conquered, few reorganized social life with such consistency. The Mongol approach was systemic. It treated people as components within a larger design. For the women subjected to this design, the loss extended beyond autonomy. It extended to narrative. Their experiences were not framed as suffering. They were framed as administrative success. This reframing is what allowed the system to persist without challenge. At this point in the story, it becomes necessary to pause and reflect. Histories like this survive not because they were preserved carefully, but because traces remain despite efforts to normalize them. If examining those traces matters to you, if refusing to accept silence as completeness feels important, then continuing this work alongside Dark Inquest history is not passive viewing.
It is participation in remembering what power preferred to forget. As the empire matured, legal codes reinforced these practices without naming them. Laws emphasized loyalty, obedience, and order.
They did not address the methods by which those qualities were enforced. The absence of prohibition was interpreted as permission. Over time, what had once been extraordinary became routine. Some women adapted by internalizing the new order. Survival required learning its expectations quickly. Others faded from record entirely. Disappearance did not always mean death. It often meant absorption so complete that individuality no longer registered. Names were replaced by roles, histories by functions. The long-term psychological impact of this cannot be measured directly, but its effects are visible in what followed.
Regions absorbed into the empire experienced rapid shifts in cultural memory. Stories were interrupted, lineages blurred, the past became fragmented. This fragmentation was not accidental. It reduced the likelihood of collective identity forming around shared loss. From the perspective of imperial stability, the system worked. Rebellions were limited, administration was efficient, trade expanded. These outcomes are often emphasized in assessments of Mongol governance. What is less often addressed is the cost at the human level, paid quietly, repeatedly, and without acknowledgement. The wives of surrendered enemies were not treated as individuals whose consent mattered. They were treated as variables in an equation of power. Their lives were adjusted to balance the empire's needs. That adjustment was permanent. As decades passed, the original acts of reorganization were no longer remembered as acts, they were remembered as tradition. New generations accepted the world they inherited without knowing what had been removed to create it. The absence of outrage was mistaken for justice. This is the danger of systems that operate without visibility. When harm is bureaucratized, it resists moral evaluation. It becomes difficult to point to a single moment of wrongdoing. Responsibility diffuses. Accountability disappears. The story of how Genghis Khan's empire treated enemy wives after surrender is not shocking because of excess. It is shocking because of restraint, because of how little needed to be said, because of how effectively silence did the work of force. And yet, this was not the end of their story. The consequences of these practices extended far beyond the lifetime of the empire's founder.
They shaped successor states, influenced regional customs, and left legacies that persisted long after Mongol rule receded. To understand those legacies, we must follow the story forward into what happened when the system outlived the men who designed it. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, the system he set in motion no longer depended on his presence. It had become institutional. Authority passed to his successors, but the mechanisms of control remained intact, refined by experience and protected by precedent. What had once been justified as a measure of wartime necessity was now embedded in governance.
For women absorbed into the empire through surrender, this transition brought no relief. In some ways, it made their position more permanent. The founding chaos of conquest gave way to order, and order rarely revisits its origins. What mattered now was continuity. The system had proven effective, and effectiveness replaced morality as the guiding principle. Under subsequent Khans, administrative records grew more detailed. Census lists, household registers, and tribute accounts expanded. Yet even as documentation increased, individual women remained largely invisible. They appeared as numbers, as dependents, as components of households. Their inner lives were not recorded. Their losses were not considered relevant data. This invisibility served a purpose. By removing personal context,
the empire ensured that no single story could challenge the legitimacy of the whole. Suffering became diffuse, untraceable to any one decision-maker. When responsibility belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one. The children raised within these reassigned households grew up without access to their mother's former identities. Language shifted. Customs changed. Memory was diluted. This was not enforced through constant punishment, but through environment. What is never spoken of eventually becomes unthinkable. Historians often note the Mongol Empire's relative tolerance of religion and culture. This observation is accurate, but incomplete. Tolerance existed at the level of belief, not at the level of loyalty. Cultural expression was permitted as long as it did not compete with imperial authority. Family structures, however, were never neutral. They were the primary sites where loyalty was formed. By reshaping those structures, the empire shaped the future. Women who had once belonged to defeated elites found themselves navigating a world where their past offered no leverage. Some became intermediaries, learning to operate within the system to protect what little agency remained. Others withdrew into silence. Adaptation took many forms, but all were constrained. The psychological strain of living under constant evaluation did not disappear with time. It became normalized. Expectations were internalized. The need to anticipate authority, to avoid attracting attention, shaped behavior in subtle ways. This form of control left few marks, but it endured. Outside observers, including later chroniclers, struggled to interpret this reality. From a distance, the empire appeared stable, even meritocratic. Advancement was possible, order was maintained. These qualities were contrasted favorably against the chaos of earlier regimes. What was missing from this comparison was the unseen labor required to sustain that appearance. As the empire fragmented into successor states, many of its administrative practices were inherited rather than dismantled. Local rulers adapted them to their own needs.
The original justifications were forgotten, but the outcomes persisted. Women continued to be treated as instruments of alliance and stability, rather than as autonomous individuals. This continuity reveals an uncomfortable truth about historical systems of power. Once a method proves effective, it rarely disappears on ethical grounds alone. It fades only when it becomes inefficient or visibly destabilizing. The treatment of surrendered women never reached that threshold. It remained hidden enough to persist. In regions once ruled by the Mongols, oral traditions preserved fragments of these experiences.
Stories told quietly, within families, carried the emotional truth absent from official records. These stories rarely named names. They focused instead on feelings, displacement, loss, adaptation. They survived because they were useful, not because they were sanctioned. Written history, by contrast, favored outcomes. It measured success in territory controlled and rebellion suppressed. It did not measure the cost of silence. There is a tendency to distance ourselves from these practices by assigning them to a brutal past. This distance is comforting, but misleading. The mechanisms at work, reorganization of family structures, erasure of identity, normalization of control, are not unique to one empire or one era. They appear wherever power seeks permanence. What distinguishes the Mongol case is clarity. The empire's rapid expansion forced it to innovate quickly. Its solutions were direct, efficient, and scalable. They reveal with unusual transparency how systems prioritize stability over humanity. For the women at the center of this story, justice was never part of the equation. Their experiences were not weighed against imperial needs. They were assumed to be adaptable,
replaceable, and silent. That assumption shaped policy, and policy shaped lives. As centuries passed, the memory of these women receded further. Their stories were overshadowed by narratives of conquest and trade. The empire's role in connecting East and West received admiration. Its internal costs were treated as incidental. But absence does not mean insignificance. The fact that these stories are difficult to reconstruct is itself evidence of how thoroughly they were suppressed. Silence was not a coincidence. It was an outcome.
Understanding this does not require condemnation or apology. It requires recognition. Recognition that power often operates most effectively when it avoids spectacle. Recognition that suffering can be administered quietly through paperwork and routine. Recognition that what history omits can matter as much as what it records. As we approach the final stage of this account, one question remains unresolved. What happens when a system built on erasure outlives the moment that created it? How does history deal with lives that were never allowed to speak for themselves?
The answer lies not in the empire's rise, but in its aftermath, and in what remembering these women now represents. When the Mongol Empire eventually fractured, its institutions did not vanish overnight. Borders shifted, rulers changed, banners fell. But the social arrangements imposed during conquest proved stubborn. Systems designed to control loyalty outlived the urgency that created them. What remained was a world shaped by decisions made generations earlier, decisions that had quietly reordered lives without ever recording their cost. For the women absorbed into the empire through surrender, there was no moment of restoration.
No official return of identity. No acknowledgement that what had been taken was unjust. History moved forward without them, carrying only the benefits of stability while leaving the human expense uncounted. In later centuries, scholars debated whether the Mongol Empire represented progress or devastation. They argued over trade routes, religious tolerance, and administrative innovation. Rarely did they ask how that order was maintained at the most intimate level. Rarely did they examine whose autonomy was considered expendable in the pursuit of permanence. The wives of surrendered enemies were not remembered as individuals because remembering them would have complicated the narrative. Their experiences did not fit neatly into stories of conquest or governance. They revealed that empire building was not only about armies and laws, but about controlling private life so thoroughly that resistance became unthinkable. This is why their absence from the record matters. It tells us that history is not only written by the victors, but edited by them, that silence can be manufactured, that entire categories of experience can be erased, not through denial, but through normalization.
When something is treated as routine, it stops being questioned. The most enduring impact of this system was not the suffering it caused in a single generation, but the precedent it set. It demonstrated that stability could be achieved by quietly dismantling personal identity, that loyalty could be engineered by restructuring families, that fear did not need to be loud to be effective. These lessons did not disappear with the Mongols. They resurfaced in different forms, under different names, in different empires. Each time the language changed, the logic remained.
Remembering how Genghis Khan's empire treated enemy wives after surrender is not about assigning modern judgment to the past. It is about recognizing patterns. It is about understanding how power justifies itself by redefining what is considered normal. It is about seeing that some of the most consequential violence in history leaves no visible wounds. The women at the center of this story were denied the dignity of testimony. They were not allowed to frame their own experiences. The final injustice was not only what they endured, but how completely their voices were excluded from the record.
And yet, by examining what was erased, we interrupt that exclusion. To remember them now is not to speak for them, but to acknowledge that their lives mattered, even when the system insisted they did not. It is to recognize that silence is not evidence of peace, and absence is not proof of consent. This is where the story closes, not with resolution, but with awareness. If preserving the memory of those history tried to absorb into silence feels necessary rather than optional, then subscribing to Dark Inquest History is not about supporting a channel. It is about refusing to let omission stand in for truth. It is about ensuring that erased lives are not erased again. Because the last thing these women were denied was remembrance. And that denial does not have to be permanent.